Hello and welcome. This is a video on the Quebec education system. It's just a brief history for my students who need to understand some of the background about where our education comes from. So this is a timeline that I created. There's tons of mistakes. Just talking about overall Quebec's history. You can have a look. We're going to create one of these in class. You can freeze now if you want. So let's talk about the educational beliefs and structures at the start of Quebec education. So if we look at early education in Quebec around the 1800s to even the 1960s, education in Quebec, as you might remember, was heavily influenced by religious institutions. So with Catholic and Protestant school boards operating separately. Schools were primarily concerned with religious and moral instruction. And education wasn't really universally accessible. Not everyone could have access to school. By the early 20th century, education began to evolve, but it really was still fragmented. So some people had access, especially if you were wealthy, and it was really unevenly distributed. And especially if you were living out in rural areas, you often had a lack of access to education, as you see in these sort of one-room schoolhouses way out in the back of nowhere. Okay. You probably remember the Quiet Revolution from your history classes. So the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s was really important for Quebec's education system because the period was characterized by a push for modernization and secularization. And education at this point became a real political tool. The government actually took control of the education system away from the religious authorities and established a Ministry of Education. Yes, our Ministry of Education to standardize and improve educational access and quality so that all Quebecers would have access to education no matter what their socioeconomic status was or where they were living. The reforms aimed to create a more equitable system and to create a distinct Quebec identity, especially through Quebec education, right? Proud to be Quebecers. And that went well until the 1990s. So in the 1990s, Quebec had a look at what was going on in the educational system and held a summit on education. They recognized that there was a lot of challenges still to address. They were focusing on improving educational outcomes. I don't know if you remember, but there was a really big dropout rate for high school students. So a lot of people did not go and graduate high school, and it was quite marked when compared to the rest of Canada and the world. They were addressing what they saw as teacher shortages, and hey, guess what? Still an issue. And adapting to demographic changes as the world began to modernize. They were looking to create a reform to better align education with the needs of a modern economy and modern society. So in the early 2000s, we saw significant educational reforms in Quebec. So the result of the Summit on Education was La Réforme éducative, the educational reform. And the idea here was a real shift away from content, which was what was typically taught in those one-room schoolhouses, memorize your verbs, memorize facts about history, and then get tested and then forget it all. What they really wanted to see was a shift towards competency-based learning. And that approach really focuses on developing students' abilities to apply knowledge in real-world situations rather than just the facts, right? Quebec education was restructured to prioritize competencies, so skills. And they wanted to prepare students to enter the world by fostering things like critical thinking, problem solving, adaptability. So that was the real goal of the Réforme éducative. I don't know how successful it was because I think maybe perhaps critical thinking and problem solving and adaptability are still not quite the focus, but that's editorialization. So we'll have a look now. The key idea is that all subject matters, whether you were taking math or French or science or history or geography, physical education, English, they would all develop skills for the 21st century. So things like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, things that would be adaptable to a changing world. So this is what they came up with. This is the Quebec Education Program. This one is particularly for secondary school education. And you can see that we have, the social sciences, we have languages, so French and English, typically arts education, personal development, we have math, science, and technology, so the STEM ones. What's interesting, though, is you're going to see that, they started with construction of identity, things that they thought would be really important, worldview and empowerment. And from there, they felt that the best way to do that was to have 5 broad areas of learning. So we had personal and career planning, health and well-being, environmental awareness and consumer rights and responsibility, citizenship and community life, and media literacy. So all of the subject matters would be trying to teach these skills. So in English, you could teach media literacy, you could have a unit on personal and career planning. Math would maybe look at environmental awareness and consumer rights and responsibility. So all of these subject matters were meant to create the broad areas of learning. In addition to the broad areas of learning, there were the cross-curricular competencies, which you see out here. So the intellectual competencies on the outside, and we're going to have a closer look at those. There were 9 originally, but they got reduced to 5. So just to recap again, there were 5 broad areas of learning: health and well-being, personal career planning, environmental awareness, media literacy, citizenship, and community life. So this is what you're going to see in the units that you teach when you're teaching English, that they tend to join at least one of these broad areas of learning. And anytime we are working in the classroom, we're supposed to be encouraging critical judgment, adopting effective work methods, and communicating appropriately and cooperating with others. Okay. So in addition to these broad areas of learning and cross-curricular competencies, we're also encouraged, or we're supposed to do competencies for subject matters. So for example, in math, they would have a certain number of math competencies to develop. Science has science competencies. And English as a second language, which is the subject you're teaching, there are 3 competencies. And you're going to see that here. So there's 1, 2, 3. This is the diagram for the elementary program. You're going to see that the one exception is cycle 1. So that's grade 1 and grade 2, where there are only 2 competencies. But for secondary, for grade 3, 4, 5, 6, and all of secondary, there are 3. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the elementary program and why there are only 2 competencies in cycle 1. So yeah, there's 2 competencies in cycle 1, just a reminder that that's an anomaly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So yeah, so these are the competencies for English as a second language in the core program, and there are 3 of them, right? So the student needs to learn how to interact orally in English, so that's competency 1. So that's speaking, but not just speaking, it's interaction. So standing up in front of the class is not, and saying an oral presentation is not interacting orally, because there's no interaction. You need to be able to sit with a person and converse in English. Competency 2 is reinvests understanding of texts. So once you watch, read, or listen to a text, whether it's a podcast or a film or a YouTube or a book or a magazine, whatever, you take ideas from that, you really understand ideas and use it in something else, whether you're talking or whether you're writing and producing a text. And the third one is, of course, writing. So students are able to write in English, but also as they get into secondary, they are also able to produce media texts. So that was the goal of the reform, and it went pretty well, I think, except for whenever you have any sort of major shift in education, there's usually a pushback. And the pushback here was that people were not comfortable with something that was just skills-based. People really wanted to see how content, how knowledge, when fit into those skills. When do we teach students vocabulary? When do we teach them expressions? How does that work? So just a quick reminder, we have the summit of the educational summit. In the 2000s, we have the Réforme éducative implemented in primary schools. The reform comes to secondary schools in 2005. And after all the hoopla, in 2009, we have the progression of learning. So this is what is published in response to demand for content-based curriculum. So you have a couple of documents. The first one is the program, the Quebec Education Program, which is all of that skills-based stuff. So all the different competencies and what that looks like. And then you have the progression of learning. And the progression of learning looks a little bit like this. This is just a snapshot from one of the ones from primary. So this is the kind of content that you would be expected to teach. You're going to see as we dig into this a little further. In grade 1, we introduce, for example, responding to instructions, and then in grade 3, 4, they're able to give instructions, delaying speaking, asking for help. So these are different expressions that we're going to be teaching. And these arrows and stars represent when you introduce it and when the student should have acquired it. So that's it for this short video on the history of Quebec education. My next advice to you now is to go watch the video on the QEP for new teachers, which will supplement your understanding. Thank you for watching.